Good morning. My name is Rain Russell, and this is WBCR Bloomfield College Radio. Today, I'll be representing Inkululeko, a nonprofit organization that works to help underprivileged students in South Africa advance educationally from grade 8 to 12 to get into university. I will be interviewing Bloomfield College's very own Vice President of Student Affairs, Dr. Patrick Lamy, on Black Lives Matter, but more specifically, Black Education Matters. So, how are you today?
I'm doing well today, and thank you for the opportunity to be interviewed and to share some thoughts on this particular topic. It's a beautiful day in North Jersey.
So, I first want to ask you, what was school like for you growing up, and what challenges, if any, did you face?
Well, you may not know, Rain, but I grew up in the projects in the Bronx. And so I grew up in the public school system, attended PS 32, which was on the other side of the Bronx. And the challenges began very early. Growing up as as a child of an immigrant family in the projects was challenging enough. My parents attempted to send me to the other side of the Bronx. When you talk about, systemic disadvantages. So we lived in an area where the school system was so terrible that at the age of 6, 7, or 8, I was taking 2 buses across town to try to get to what's considered the better school. And so it was very obvious at a very young age that the systems put in place were very different for those who lacked resources versus those who had a little bit more.
Oh wow, that sounds super hard. Like taking 2 whole buses, like Jesus.
2 whole buses, and at the age of 8, 9, I moved to New Jersey when I was turning 13, and so we by myself as a kid. That was expected.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
That's so young. I don't even know what I was doing at that age, let alone having to travel like that and be out on your own.
Well, there's a lot of people. I have a friend of mine, her daughter, who used to be a student here, had never ridden a bus until she was 19 years old. I mean, that was like, she had a job at the mall, and her first bus ride was to Willowbrook Mall, and she thought it was the worst experience ever. So when I heard that story, I shared with her, well, I don't understand this because I was riding the bus by myself at 6 and 7. So, unreal.
Yeah.
It's a generational issue, though.
Definitely. So do you believe it is harder for students, specifically students of color, to find motivation in trying to complete school when they are constantly given the short end of the stick?
I think the challenges are greater for many reasons, and it's not the same for every student. I will say that a number of African Americans and Latinos and people of color in general, or not first generation, they've kind of turned the corner and have children who have some privilege. Mm-hmm. And I'm learning that now for the young men and women who are born after 2000, the millennials, and there's some of them come from a different background where they have parental support in the home, they have access to different resources, and for them it may be somewhat different. But for the majority, it's not. I think that a number of, particularly a number of first-generation students and students who are from the low-income bracket, still face some of the same challenges. And coming from underserved communities where resources are not abundant and even the technology is substandard, and you can tell the difference between a school district in a poor community versus a school district in an affluent community. It's very different set of resources, very different level of commitment by the people who teach our students in some of those circles. So I think the students have an opportunity for success, but the level of motivation and support that they need is greater than most. Yeah. I think they need mentorship. They need to really have people that care about their well-being, not just as students, but as young men and women, to make sure that they're really being successful inside and outside of the classroom. I'll tell you a story of a student from your hometown that I dealt with several years ago. And his point was, when I leave to go home during the break, I'm afraid I'm not going to come back.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the reality of the circumstances where people reside, because his family was involved in other stuff that he did not want to go back to that environment.
Mm-hmm.
Now, so for some young men and women, staying in that environment, and if you don't have an outlet, it's tough and difficult for them to make that turn, to pivot.
I definitely agree with that. It's definitely, I feel like, depending on where you're from, as you said, it's very hard, even in that aspect, to get yourself to advance or find motivation within yourself to want to advance. So I think it's very important, I feel like, for educators and school systems in general to really honor the fact that you really don't know where a lot of students are coming from, and you should try to meet them on some type of level of, outside of this work, I am here for you in that way, to be that, person you might need. Yeah.
And not everybody's, and to your point, education, being an educator comes with a level of passion that you must have. And you have a level of passion and compassion. You got to have both, and empathy to kind of understand people. This is, this work, you got to want to do it because it's so rewarding when you do it right.
Mm-hmm.
So I think teachers, educators, administrators on all levels of education, whether you're in the state level, political level, or school level, ground level, you got to want to do this work.
Definitely. So that brings me to talk about South Africa. So in South Africa, the school system largely revolves around where they are from, social class, and skin color. Have you ever experienced or seen this within communities in the United States?
Well, yeah, I think that's, that's an interesting comparison. That's the structure in the South African school system, but that's not that surprising. But in the United States, if you look at it in the context of how people live in different types of communities, you may be, some of our students, at least in the context of our institution here, have never left the city where they grew up in. So it's a homogenous group. So it is very likely that although it's not a structured class system, as in the case of South Africa, by default of systemic disadvantages and resources, people of a certain class find themselves in a certain community and find themselves subject to certain incidences and experiences because they can't afford to be in a different community. So you will find, for example, that in some neighborhoods, the average income, family income, is relatively the same. So, which means that those families can't move to the neighborhood where they see people that are very different from them. And unfortunately, for us and for the American school system and educational system, we may not do it by skin color, meaning complexion does not really drive where your access to educational systems. But class, in terms of your level of family wealth and income, absolutely does. So by default, there is a relationship there that we're compartmentalized in certain areas based on the fact that we don't have the resources to be elsewhere.
Mm-hmm.
So although in the South African system, they say this is what it is, for us it happens by default.
Right.
Because the system has failed part of the people it's supposed to serve.
Yes. I know where I live, where I went to school is kind of in the heart almost of the city, and my city in general isn't really the most extravagant. It's a lot that goes on. It's a lot of poor people, poor community, but if you travel, maybe 10, 15 minutes, and you'll see schools that are much bigger, that have much more resources than we had or that we had access to. We had teachers who literally never been, they work in my city, they work in the school system in my city, but they don't live there. They live elsewhere. So they have no idea about the students that they're teaching at all.
1,000%. And that's, and that's difficult for them to your point is, how do you relate to those students beyond the classroom? Because When they leave, they go to Sicklerville, Cherry Hill, all the surrounding communities around Camden. And those students stay in that same space. And so, it's, and if they don't understand that there's a relationship between your out of classroom experience and how you come to class, there's a disconnect there, because you have to understand the entire student experience. Let me give you an example that I've dealt with in my career. And this is a pretty tough example, but it's relevant to what the conversation we're having. About maybe 15 years ago, it was a long time ago, and this is when, your community doesn't really understand what the student is trying to do. There was during final exams, and this young lady called my office, and this is reality. And she lived in I guess that's the Fifth Ward, the other side of Newark, like closer to Elizabeth. And she didn't have money to take the bus to come take her finals. I mean, that's the reality of it. So she studied all night, prepared. She was ready. She's a good student, solid, strong student. Her family didn't have $2. That's real. And so I went and I picked her up and brought her to campus, and I took her home later. But what that taught me was, not even in the case of this motivated young person that we talked about earlier, who in college, she was probably in her senior year. I mean, advanced and going to do it. Even in that situation where the student has the drive, they have the capacity and the ability, that small resource, $2 to travel 2 zones to the campus, could have crippled her experience for that semester. So, when you think about if somebody in my position don't understand that and said, find your way here, that's not my problem, which is what some people would say, I don't know, what do you want me to do? As a college, we have all these policies about should you transport students personally in your car, and this is the insurance liability. But when it comes to caring, and back to the point I made earlier about being compassionate and having a passion for this work, you just say, you know what, I'm going to do this in spite of, because this young person needs me.
Yes. To touch further on that, as an educator or person, working in the school system, and have you found that students of color struggle to connect with you personally or other teachers due to their background? Or when you went to school, did you have a problem connecting with teachers and other educators?
Well, I will tell you, even in the Bronx, and that's back to your example earlier, I lived in a mostly Black and Latino community. None of the teachers in the school where I went to the other side looked Latino or Black. And so I will say that the disconnect was obviously there. When I moved to New Jersey, I saw more people of color, more teachers of color in New Jersey, to be honest with you. The first teacher I had a relationship with in a way that helped me to grow was the first time I was instructed by the first Black man ever in the 8th grade. I had never met a Black male teacher until I was in 8th grade. And his name was John Smith. And the reason why this is important to my experience, John Smith took our class and started teaching us a lot of Black history. We started reading books that had to do with our experience, which I never experienced in the Bronx. And his thing was about reading and awakening young men and women to kind of learn to ask questions. And that was the first experience I had as a student. Then I realized how important it was for a teacher to care. Because I never, nobody ever showed me a level of care before in that way. And I think that experience reading books like I Know Why the Caged Bird Sing by Maya Angelou, Perry Thomas, Down These Mean Streets, Man, Child in the Promised Land by Carl Brown, The Contender, like all of these books that I've never even heard of. We were reading these books, and all of them were about Jubilee. All of them were about Black experiences. And then he had us reading about Malcolm X. reading the I Have a Dream and talking about it, things that system did not teach. So I think those kind of experiences kind of set the foundation for me to want to be a different kind of educator later on in life. To your other point of your question is, am I relatable to the students that I serve? There's two things that I think that a lot of our students misinterpret, until I talk to them in a very honest and open way. And I think sometimes people see someone who's had an advanced education, carry themselves a certain way, they think they're not approachable. Mm-hmm. So I'm constantly battling with that, because until people speak to me, they think like, oh, that's Dr. Lamy, you don't want to go in that office because you might be in trouble, and that's far from the truth. And, but so I'm constantly combating that perception. And so I'm constantly engaged in conversation with students to let them know that I don't come from a silver spoon. I was raised in the worst neighborhoods ever in my life. I let people know that I ended up in New Jersey because I was stabbed at the age of 12. These are real experiences for me. It's not like what you see here doesn't define me. And so I spent a lot of time removing that barrier. But for the most part, I've been fortunate in my career. I've mentored over 200 men and women in my career.
That's beautiful. I mean, I feel like mainly like coming from a student perspective, it's easier for us to kind of place that prejudgment on educators in general, or people higher up in the school system, because we're used to having people who don't care, or having people who are kind of just like, this is my job and that's it. Like, I'm not here for nothing else. Like, this is that. If you don't get what I'm teaching you, find help elsewhere. I'm not helping you kind of vibes. And I think that's kind of what goes into when we approach people. It's kind of like, I don't know if I really want to talk to them. I don't know if they're going to understand. Like, yeah.
That's understandable. It's all part of perspective. Sometimes people think, I was told by a very wise person a long time ago, and this was a good friend of mine, and he said, if you don't ask the question, he said that the question you choose not to ask is always a no. And I didn't understand it at first. I said, what does that mean? He says, well, if you want to approach someone and ask something of them and you decide not to, then you just gave yourself a no to whatever it is you wanted. So it's the same thing. It says, so inaction, his point was, inaction is actually a strong action. So not doing anything is the same thing as a strong action. It's a decision to not do it.
Right.
And so, so I make that point to say that, people just have to take a chance. And kind of, the same way I want to get to know students, I would hope that they have the curiosity to say, hey, tell me about your career path and how you got here.
Yeah. It's such a weird line between students and teachers and other like staff when it comes to school. Like, school is such a complex situation, and I feel like it's so hard for a lot of people to want to reach out or ask for help, especially if they're used to not doing that. Like, yeah, it's so hard.
But it's all part of the coming out of your own comfort zone. It's the same way I would go up to a student, like, how your day's going today? Just initiate conversation.
Yeah.
And the same way, sometimes we got to go out of the way and say, you know what, there's nothing wrong with a good morning and a hello.
Yes, I agree. Okay, so a Department of Education report showed that in South Africa, less than a third of students finish grade 12 by the age of 18. However, Inkululeko helps bridge the gap for learners to be able to complete school from grade 8 to grade 12. So have you seen any organizations, or have you been a part of any organizations that helped students achieve that, like, go from grade to grade?
I mean, like help them to complete early?
Yeah, or like complete on time. But
Right.
you know how students from underprivileged backgrounds sometimes it's easy for them to just drop out and then never return. So have you been a part of any organizations, or have you seen any organizations that actually keep up with those kind of students and help them pass each grade?
Yes, I have. And I'll share a quick story with you, which is relatable to this point. When I first came out of high school, and I applied to 3 colleges: Montclair State, Rutgers, New Brunswick, and Caldwell.
Okay.
And quite honestly, I did not know what EOF was, which is the Education Opportunity Fund Program. Mm-hmm. And my grades were pretty sound, so I got accepted to regular admit in all schools. But the EOF, the Caldwell EOF department reached out to me because their program was based on supporting students of who are pretty much of color, not based on their academic preparation. It was like color and income. Mm-hmm. So I was invited for an interview to Caldwell, and I was interviewed by a couple of people whose names you may recognize. Okay. One of them was Lieutenant Governor Sheila Oliver, was the EOF counselor at Caldwell College at the time. And the other was Frances Tebow, who's now the head of the Women Ministers of New Jersey. And a third was this woman named Diane Hill, who's a provost at Rutgers, New York. Mm-hmm. So now, mind you, this is my first time encountering women that I'm kind of like so blown away by. I mean, I've been I told you about my 8th grade situation.
Yeah.
So these 3 women interviewed me, and after an hour talking with the 3 of them, I knew that I had made a decision to dismiss Rutgers and Montclair State right then and there. Mm-hmm. And so I joined the EOF program, and being an EOF student and the support of these 3 women to kind of reach out to me to say, hey, how's your day going? Stop by the office. How's this class going? Did you get help? You know, like all the resources like right there. And if not for the EOF program to being at a predominantly white institution where most people didn't care about the Black students there at the time, if not for EOF, I don't know where my life would have been. I think that completely changed everything, which is why I think it's one of the signature programs in our state that needs to be preserved. It makes a difference. They graduate minority students at a higher rate than just about any other program in our state.
Wow. I did not know that. Mm-hmm. That's good. Because I feel like I do see a lot more, and I will say this, a lot more organizations as you try to advance into college, but I don't see as many that are really strong and solid when it comes to like high school. Mm-hmm. And I think that I feel like there should be more organizations that actually follow up what they're saying they stand for with high school students, in high school, because that's where everything starts making a difference, a shift. Like, I feel like at least most people graduate, middle school, elementary school, stuff like that. But when it comes to high school, that's where things start falling off before you can even touch college.
Before you touch college. Yeah, I think the high school system itself, there are several smaller initiatives on a district level that I know of that's happening in New Jersey. But some of them are very successful. You have, Newark is doing some amazing work right now with Shabazz High School in robotics, which kind of blew me away. Shabazz High School had one of the worst reputations in the 80s and 90s. And now these students who are from very modest means are building robots at the age of 14, 15, and going to like the top technical colleges in the country. And I think that if we start looking at our young men and women of color from the lens of incapacity of ability and not as a deficit. See, sometimes you heard me a few times use the word underserved. I never said disadvantaged. Right. And the words you use to describe people matter. And I think sometimes people from underserved communities, that doesn't mean they're a disadvantaged persons. It's somebody failed them. Yeah. Somebody failed them in that community. Yeah. So I think that But when you give them the right resources and put them in the right places with the right people, anything can happen.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm watching some of these schools that were considered, that had graduation rates. Shabazz graduation rate was in the 20 to 30% several years ago. Now they're upwards of 60, 70% graduating their class. I think that makes a difference.
Definitely.
So that's the example I can share with that.
That's really good. Like I think it's not hard for people to fund, I feel like, more urban communities. I feel like people just choose not to because of whatever their preconceived thoughts may be about the people in the community and the kids in the community. But I feel like it's really not hard to just be like, nah, we can do this. Like, this is possible. So that's really great. But how have you been during this pandemic?
Let's see. How would I describe it? It's been some scary moments.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been some lonely moments because, sometimes you try to protect yourself to the point where you just find yourself in isolation. So I will give you a clear example. I went out to dinner for the first time 3 weeks ago since March.
Oh,
like,
wow.
Literally, I've been at home cooking, I've been confining myself to my place.
Right.
I only visit one friend's house who I know is doing the same thing I'm doing. So I know they're not out, they're social distancing, they're not in public places. Like, I was doing things with like people. Mm-hmm. If I heard anybody travel somewhere, I don't deal with them. I was like, listen, stay where you are. I was protecting myself. It was about self-preservation. But on top of that, doing all of that, I lost too. I lost family members, my elderly family members who just didn't make it, who ended up in the hospital. My nephew, who was probably just a couple of years older than you, almost passed away with COVID.
Oh, my.
He was in the hospital for 2 weeks. He's only 26 years old. And healthy, and caught it at work at PC Richards. Wow. Before they shut down. Yeah. And ended up on a ventilator, everything. So, and he was 26. And so when I saw that happen to him, I realized this is not an older person's disease. When this first came out, people thought this is the older people, the senior citizens in the senior care facilities are dealing with that. When my nephew was in the hospital, I couldn't go see him because you're not allowed visitation when you're a COVID patient. So he was there for 2 weeks and he didn't have his charger. So about less than a week later, nobody could talk to him because his phone died.
Right.
And we didn't know how he was doing. We were calling the main desk. They just giving us updates. But I didn't talk to him until he came out and nobody was able to see him. And so when you think about that, the sense of, if I think I'm feel lonely because I'm protecting myself, I'm just imagine feeling like I'm about to die and there's not a family member can be there to be with me. That's real. That was real. So it's scary. But as an educator on a college campus, I'm concerned. So, before we got on this call, I was in a meeting about writing a student up for refusing to wear their mask on campus. Things of that, like that decision is a selfish one, and people need to understand that. It's making that decision impacts everybody else. So, right. So we have to, we have the hard work to do now of really disciplining people because they're not willing to protect themselves and others, and we all have to be protecting each other.
Yeah.
And so when you refuse to wear your mask and you want to walk up on people all over the place, you pose a risk to the rest of the community. So, and I can't accept that. So it's been very challenging, and dealing with students like yourself who really don't want to be home, and trying to make sure they have the resources at home to do the work. I have a student now who we're about to find a way to pay for them to have internet access, because how do you do online work when you can afford internet?
Right.
How do you do that? It's kind of like, so it's a lot of challenges, and we have a number of students that we gave Chromebooks to this semester on loan because they didn't have the resources. So as a nation, all colleges and universities are faced with this major challenge right now. This is a major obstacle
Mm-hmm.
in the way of education of students and the work that educators need to do.
Yes, I really agree with that. But it's crazy that you say that, you know, people are struggling with, I would say. Because I heard, like, I know some people who, why they say they don't like to wear the mask. And I know why a lot of people have chosen not to go back on campus for reasons of, like, they are scared about, you know, possibly getting sick or the contact, so they rather just stay home. But then when you stay home, it's like you still have to deal with all these other things going on while you're trying to achieve, you know, academic success. So it's like really a double-edged sword, but at the same time it's like, how can we as people figure out a way to properly navigate through this pandemic? So do you think that is harder for educators or for students when it comes to learning virtually?
I think it depends. I think some of our senior faculty who have been teaching in person for 30 years, it's a major learning curve to switch to online learning. And for the students who have never taken an online class or not technologically savvy, it's a major learning curve. Then you have the people on the flip side of that. You have the students who've been doing everything on some technological platform who can get it like this, you know. Then you have the faculty who are more familiar with technology who can do the work very easily. So it's a blended kind of situation. Not everybody experiences the same thing, but it's all based on, back to our conversation earlier, what was your exposure before this happened? You know,
Right.
Your exposure was that I'm familiar with using this as a major tool, an iPad and my computer as a tool, then I can pivot to make this work. If your exposure was, I use my phone to make phone calls, I don't know really anything about online, any learning of any form, then yeah, this is a major challenge. It depends on the person. For our community, it's a mix, but I have faculty who didn't know I'd use Zoom. They've never used a video communication platform before. So that's real. Now, for some of our students, you guys been on Snapchat, you know, all of these other things, so you can switch to that pretty easily. One of our instructors said she couldn't see the students because she never turned on. She never had a camera. Her camera turned on so they could see her. So it was like a whole learning curve for her, but that's the reality.
Yeah. I know for Inkululeko, they have also had to migrate virtually with their students and, you know, ship them supplies and stuff. So it was when you brought that up, I was like, that's real crazy because everybody literally everywhere has had to literally migrate to something different to protect everyone, like staff, teachers, students. Like, it's really, really, like, crazy. But I know they also offer mental and emotional support for students and staff. So I was wondering if there's anything like that in place at Bloomfield.
Well, I'm not going to say that that's available for staff in that way because our services are really student focused.
Okay.
So we certainly have all the resources available for some psychological counseling. We moved to virtual. I don't know if you knew that we have a virtual counseling center. That part of our counseling center is virtual. You could actually make an appointment and have this counseling session the way that you're not talking right now.
Oh, wow. I did not know that.
That's happening now, yeah. A lot of students are doing that. And so in-person is really for a student who wants, you have to request an in-person appointment. Just about all appointments are virtual. So we have to pivot in that space too. We have to join some networks and hotlines when the office is closed that you can call and still virtually get in touch with a service that can talk with you. So all of those resources are available to our students. Our employees, however, we're relying on them to take advantage of their own primary care physicians, the emotional therapists or what have you. But services that are on a college campus are dominantly student-centered because you guys pay tuition to come here, so the services we provide is for you.
Right.
Because can you imagine if you needed an appointment in a counseling center and they were like, no, Dr. Lamy has the first appointment. Are you kidding? So our services are tailored for our students.
That makes sense. Would you say that the pandemic has made it harder for students of color, students with underprivileged backgrounds, to stay motivated in doing homework, classwork, or comprehend lessons virtually?
1,000%. I will say that the challenge for the student population you just described is much greater because the resources that they need for success is greater. And this change in this environment, what you lose in this change is the one-on-one personal touch. You lose that. Sometimes people who have been underserved are better served in an in-person environment. They can ask questions face to face and see immediate reaction. They can stop in at some point, and say, "Hey, after class, can I see you?" I think that it forces educators to become more creative because we know that's a challenge. Mm-hmm. We know that's a challenge, so we need to make sure that we move all of our resources from tutoring online. Everything has to shift. And we have now what we're calling check-in points. So you probably haven't got a check-in, but we're doing that with mostly our first-year students and students who are not performing well at midterm.
Okay.
So you have outreach virtual check-in. Have you done this? Have you done that? Because if we don't pay attention, then the student may just get discouraged and say, you know what, I'm having a hard time with this class. I barely understand it. I'm just going to stop logging in. Mm-hmm. And that's what will happen. So because we know there's a risk of that happening, we need to be a little bit more proactive to kind of say, how do we get ahead of that?
Right.
So that we can make sure. So the first thing we did this semester, during the first 2 weeks, is we did a check of everybody who logged in and checked in on their online classes. Who logged in and who did not. Anybody who did not log in, we immediately followed up with them. Why are you not logging in? Do you need help? Call IT. Because you have to kind of coach that.
Yeah.
Because if they try to get online and they couldn't, they're just like, well, I'm not doing this.
Right.
And so if we didn't get a handle on that during week 1, then we failed them by week 2 or 3. They're too far behind.
Yeah. I know during the summer I had worked with EOF for the freshmen that were incoming, and they had just came out of high school, and now they're trying to learn, get that first kind of pre-intro to learning college stuff, but on Zoom. So we had to do a lot of checking in with them. We had to make sure that they had all the resources that they needed. And this meant literally I was checking in with people nonstop, morning, afternoon, after every little break in between classes to make sure that they had their work together, that they knew what was going on, that they understood what was going on. And it is a lot of work that I feel like people would, it's kind of something you kind of don't want to do, but it's very necessary at the same time. So I feel like it's definitely hard on that aspect of being, on that side, being a person that has to help other people understand and make sure they understand. But it's also hard being the person that needs to understand what's going on to figure it out too. So I've seen it on both ends, and it's very complicated.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I didn't know you worked with the U.S. summer program this summer. This was the first summer virtual experience we've ever had.
I was so sad about that because when I first came to Bloomfield, I had my experience be in person, and it's a way different vibe when you're in person and when you're virtual, because you lose that personal touch almost, and you gotta find a way to kind of create that, which is very difficult on the internet.
On both levels.
Yeah.
Yeah, on both levels, absolutely. I'm glad you had that experience. It's a good experience for you to take on to the next level.
Yes, definitely. So I do want to ask, as one of my final questions, maybe, is how do you think school systems can improve for students of color?
I think the first thing that needs to happen is the state and the federal government needs to understand that there's a disparity in resources. That's the first thing that needs to happen. Systems don't change by osmosis. It takes action. Mm-hmm. And it's going to take some of our politicians, our legislators, our assembly folks to kind of say, if we're looking at New Jersey in general, if we're looking at South Africa, whatever the systemic issues are, you got to fix them. Mm-hmm. You can't expect to take the same action and have a different outcome. Mm-hmm. So if we know that there's a disparity between school district A and school district D, that the gap is this wide, if we keep doing the same thing, it'll never narrow. Mm-hmm. So we'll really have to, one, make sure that families and students have access to education opportunity.
Right.
You can't say that. I'll give you a classic example of a colleague that works in the Patterson school system. I was out with her. She said she got a voicemail. She said, "Listen to this. The district sent the voicemail out to all the families and all the teachers to say, books are going to be available tomorrow this is before the school year started, between 9 and 11. It's on a first come, first served basis." So, and that was a normal voicemail. And so if I'm not there, if I don't get there early enough, now mind you, this is the day before.
Right.
So let's say you have a job, you have responsibilities. Now you got the pressure of, if I don't get there like 8 o'clock, since they start at 9 o'clock, so on a first come, first served basis, I'm not in line, my kid may not have the books to start school. So when you look at that, that's one example of, that's a systemic issue, which means that school don't have the resources for everybody. And so it leaves some parents on the periphery, on the margins, trying to figure out, well, if I don't get there on time, how am I going to get these books for my kids? Especially, I can't afford my rent. I can't. So what I'm saying to you is, when there's some systems in this country that are systemic, discrimination, racism, and classism are systemic issues. It really what they are. And systemic issues call for really movements for change. It don't happen by overnight. Right. So I think to improve the system, people, one, got to recognize that not everybody start on the same playing field. And there's a big disparity between how white, rich, wealthy America see opportunity versus Black, poor, Latino, people of color, and brown people see opportunity. Somehow there's this misperception that everybody's opportunity is the same. Civil rights is over. The kid from this neighborhood has the same opportunity to go to Harvard as the kid from this. That is so far from the truth. And until people start recognizing that there's some systemic issues that separate the haves and the have-nots, and the kids from these communities need more resources, more support, at a systemic level, from the families on up to the children, to really make the change in the educational system, and have people who live in those communities be part of those children's education. Yeah. Not visitors to those communities. So it's a lot that needs to happen.
I definitely agree. Did you find in this conversation that there's many similarities between the United States and South Africa?
Absolutely. I think the similarities. South Africa is based on, the country itself, its history is based on a major divide. It's based on a major divide between people of color and those who are not. So, and that divide is in Joburg is clear. And I read this book called Kaffir Boy. How many of you ever heard of it?
No.
It's by Matthew Mahatma. Okay. And he was raised in Johannesburg, South Africa, and he talks about the difference between his experience in the slums of Joburg versus the experiences of those who were not there. And Kaffir Boy really means nigger boy in South Africa. That's how. So he wrote it from that perspective. And he ended up leaving South Africa, making it to the United States, becoming like a renowned tennis player.
Oh, wow.
That's an experience, yeah. But I use that to say that when you talk about systemic issues, whether it's in the case of South Africa, it's a country that was based on systemic differences. America was based on systemic differences, and it still is, which is why we have Black Lives Matter now. I mean, that's an obvious telling tale of these systemic issues still exist.
Yes.
So I think there's a lot of similarities, and systemic issues always come with who has opportunity, education, opportunity, and career. All of the things that can change a person's life are controlled by systemic situations.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of parallels there.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for talking to me today, and definitely I've learned a lot about you and where you come from, and I hope that you've learned a lot about Inkululeko, about South Africa, about me and my background.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
well, I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you today, and good luck on this project. I think you're doing something very special. And I think it's people will learn from hearing about it.
Thank you so much. Again, I am Rain Russell, and this is WBCR Bloomfield College Radio. I hope that you all learned a lot about Inkululeko, about South Africa, about the United States, about Dr. Lamy, and more. Thank you again.